He was watching his ex-wife marry his best friend and doing just fine. That was the part that surprised everyone. Elliot Varden stood at the edge of the reception, 32 years old, a single father, a cardiac surgeon who spent his days holding other people's hearts together, and he was genuinely happy for them. He had made his peace. He had moved on. What he hadn't counted on was her, the woman on the terrace, 50 years old, a billion-dollar empire behind her name, and eyes that saw straight through whatever a man said to what he actually meant. His former mother-in-law. And the moment he opened his mouth, everything changed. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to the channel before we go any further. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me your city and country, because I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. You'll want every word of what comes next. The ceremony itself was beautiful, in the effortless way that weddings are when nobody in the room is pretending. Marissa's wore ivory silk. Caleb Monroe, who had been Elliot Varden's closest friend since they were both 23, and fumbling through their first year of medical residency together, stood at the altar with the kind of expression that made even cynical people feel something. The light through the chapel windows fell across the pews in long, warm stripes, and the whole afternoon had a quality to it that Elliot couldn't quite name, something like completion, maybe. The last piece of an old picture settling into the frame. Elliot sat in the third row on the groom's side and watched his former wife marry his best friend. He clapped when they kissed. He meant it. That was the part that would later seem strange to people who heard about him. Not the circumstances, not the unusual geography of who was marrying whom and how everyone was connected, but the fact that Elliot Varden had arrived at that chapel without a single knot of bitterness in his chest and left it the same way. The marriage to Marissa had ended 4 years ago, with more sadness than anger, more exhaustion than blame. They had been 25 when they married, too young and too in love with the idea of each other, to understand that love and compatibility are not always the same thing. By the time Maisie was born, they were already two people trying to share a life that didn't quite fit either of them. The divorce had been quiet. The co-parenting had been honest. What remained between them was something rarer than romance, a kind of durable respect that neither of them had expected to survive. So when Caleb had come to him 6 months ago, pale-faced and braced for impact, and told him that he and Marissa had been seeing each other for almost a year, and that he needed Elliot to know, Elliot had looked at his oldest friend for a long moment, and then said, "Well, you could have told me sooner." That was all. They'd shaken hands. Caleb had looked like he might cry. Elliot had suggested they get a beer. Maisie was 7, and she had appointed herself the official flower girl of the occasion with the gravity of someone accepting a diplomatic post. She was small for her age, with Marissa's dark hair and Elliot's stubborn brown eyes, and she had spent the last 2 weeks practicing exactly how to drop petals. Not too fast, not too slow, a precise and even trail, because, as she had explained to Elliot during one of their kitchen rehearsals, the petals are supposed to make it look like flowers are following Mom. That's the whole point, Dad. He had agreed that yes, that was the whole point. She had done it perfectly. Elliot had stood in the back of the chapel for that part, watching his daughter walk down the aisle with her little basket and her serious face, and he felt a pressure behind his sternum that had nothing to do with his cardiologist's understanding of the organ, just the ordinary human ache of watching someone you love do something that mattered to them. He managed not to embarrass himself, barely. The reception was held in the gardens of a historic estate just outside the city, the kind of venue that old families rent out and new money buys, and everyone stands around pretending they've always been comfortable in spaces like this. String lights were threaded through the oak trees. Tables were set beneath a canvas pavilion that billowed slightly in the early summer wind. The band, a real one, not a DJ, played something from the 60s that Elliot couldn't name, but that made the older guests move toward the floor. Elliot got a drink, found a table where he knew enough faces to be comfortable, and settled into the steady rhythm of a wedding reception. He talked to Caleb's brother about the drive down. He danced one obligatory song with Marissa's aunt, who was 71, and had very specific opinions about the way young men led on the floor. He checked his phone once, confirmed that Maisie was already at the kids' table eating wedding cake with focused intensity and no apparent regard for portion size, and decided she was fine. He was fine. Everything was fine. He refreshed his drink around 9 o'clock and stepped out toward the far edge of the gardens for some air. The music came through the trees in softened waves. The night had cooled down enough to make the walk worth it, He could feel the temperature difference between the pavilion's warm, crowded air and the garden's open dark. He rounded the corner of the stone terrace and stopped. A woman was standing at the railing with her back to him, looking out at the grounds. She was wearing deep burgundy, a long dress with some kind of open structure at the back that caught the light in a way that made him notice it before he noticed her. She had her arms resting on the stone, a glass of wine in one hand, and she was simply standing there, not looking at her phone, not watching the party, just standing. Elliot almost turned back. Instead, he walked to the railing and stood a few feet away. Because the view from the terrace was genuinely good, a long slope of dark lawn, the estate's old hedges in geometric shadow, a slice of low moon just clearing the tree line. He didn't say anything for a minute. She didn't either. Then he said, "I keep ending up out here." The woman turned. He recognized her then, not from personal memory, but from the photographs Marissa had kept on the bookshelf in the apartment they once shared, and from the business profile he'd seen somewhere, years ago. Lenora Bellamy, 50 years old, Marissa's mother. He had expected to feel awkward. Instead, he felt something else, which was worse, because he didn't have a clean word for it. Lenora Bellamy was striking in the particular way that certain women become striking in their 50s, when whatever they spent their 40s working through has finally settled into something composed and certain. She wasn't trying to look younger. She wasn't performing anything. She looked like a woman who had decided exactly who she was and had simply stopped arguing about it. "It's quieter out here," she said. "Yeah." He looked back at the lawn. "You're Marissa's mother." "I am." "A beat." "You're the ex-husband." "I am." Something about the way they'd both stated their respective complications, without ceremony, made the air feel lighter. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Lenora said. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She sounded genuinely curious. "I wasn't going to miss it," Elliot said. "Caleb's my closest friend, and Marissa." He thought about how to say it accurately. "We did okay, after. We figured out how to be decent to each other for Maisie's sake, and then somewhere along the way it just became real. She's a good person." Lenora studied him for a moment. Most men would find an excuse not to be here. Most men didn't have Maisie to explain things to, Elliot said. She would have known if I'd stayed home out of ego. 7-year-olds know things. Lenora looked at him again. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, not softening exactly, more like a quiet recalibration. She did beautifully today. She rehearsed the pedal distribution for 2 weeks. She has thoughts about it. Lenora laughed, a real one, not the polished social version. Short and a little surprised by itself. Marissa was the same way. She used to organize her books by emotional tone instead of author. Nobody asked her to. She just decided. Maisie organizes her toys by character importance, Elliot said. The ones with the most personality get the highest shelf. That's alarmingly logical. She's alarmingly logical. They stood in the quiet for a moment. The band drifted through something slower. Elliot looked at her and said, because the wine had made him honest in a way he hadn't expected, "Your dress is beautiful." Lenora went still. She didn't look away. She looked at him with the careful attention of someone measuring something, a precise, unhurried assessment that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then she said quietly, "You didn't mean the dress." Elliot felt the words land somewhere below his ribs. He should have laughed it off. He should have raised his glass and said something deflecting, something easy. He had about a dozen of those available. He'd spent enough years navigating busy hospital hallways and tricky family dinners to know how to redirect a moment. Instead, he stood there on the stone terrace with the music coming through the trees and his daughter's flower petals still scattered on the chapel floor somewhere behind them. And he said, "No, I don't think I did." Lenora held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned back toward the lawn and took a quiet sip of her wine. "That's honest," she said. "Is it a problem?" She was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable thinking. "I don't know yet," she said. They stood there for another 10 minutes, talking about nothing important. Marissa and Caleb, the estate, how long the drive had been, Maisie's cake intake, the particular exhaustion of wedding receptions when you're not half of the couple. When Elliot went back inside, he didn't look back, but he knew she watched him go. The drive home that night was quiet. Maisie was asleep in the back seat before they hit the highway, slumped sideways with a streak of frosting on her chin that Elliot hadn't bothered to wipe away, because she looked so thoroughly unconscious that it seemed unkind to disturb her. He drove with one hand on the wheel, and the radio low something instrumental, soft enough not to wake her, and he told himself it was nothing. A terrace, a woman, a conversation at the end of a long day. The kind of moment that felt significant at the time and dissolved in the ordinary light of the following morning. He told himself that. He almost believed it. His life was not complicated in the grand scheme. He had a schedule that would have broken a less organized person, but Elliot had long since stopped thinking of it as complicated and started thinking of it as simply the shape of things. Monday through Thursday, he operated. Friday mornings, he had clinic hours. Maisie was at school by 8, picked up by Mrs. Garland from next door on the days he couldn't make it, which was more often than he liked, but less often than it could have been. Wednesday evenings were his Marissa took Maisie for the night, and he usually spent them doing paperwork or running, occasionally both in a sequence that made him feel virtuous and tired in equal measure. He had a small house that he'd bought after the divorce because a man with a 7-year-old needed walls and a yard, and the mortgage was manageable because he drove a car that was 7 years old and did not own anything that required a monthly maintenance fee. He had a refrigerator with Maisie's drawings on it. He had a running playlist that hadn't been updated in 14 months. He had a coffee maker he'd owned since residency that had survived 2 apartments and 1 marriage and still worked, which he considered a personal achievement. This was his life. He didn't apologize for it. He didn't find it lacking. What he lacked, if he was honest, and Elliot was usually honest with himself, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable, was the specific thing that couldn't be scheduled or maintained or driven carefully for fuel efficiency. The thing that made the evenings feel long sometimes, and the mornings feel complete, only because Maisie came padding into his room at 6:15 with her hair loose and her socks mismatched, and demanded he make eggs the way he made them, not the other way. He wasn't lonely in the way that required naming. He was just aware sometimes of the particular shape of a space beside him that remained empty. He thought about the terrace more than he meant to. Not obsessively, not constantly, but in the specific way that certain moments stay at the edge of awareness, the way a melody you can't identify keeps surfacing when you're doing something else entirely. He remembered the precise quality of her voice when she'd said, "You didn't mean the dress," the certainty in it. Not accusing, not flirtatious, just accurate. The kind of observation that requires a particular kind of confidence to say out loud. He remembered the 3 seconds. He made coffee. He did hospital rounds. He went over Maisie's reading homework and had a detailed argument with her about whether a dragon qualified as a pet for the purposes of a school essay, and found himself unable to conclusively win the debate, which suggested either that the child was too sharp or that he was too tired. Possibly both. He did not think about calling anyone. He did not have Lenora Bellamy's phone number and hadn't asked for it. He had not thought of asking for it. The evening had ended the way it had ended, complete, self-contained, with no architecture for a sequel. That was fine. That was appropriate. That was the only version of this that made any sense. 3 weeks after the wedding, Maisie came home from Marissa's with a piece of information she had apparently been asked to deliver as casual as possible, which is to say she delivered it the way 7-year-olds deliver everything directly, and mid-conversation, as though it had no particular weight. She was eating an apple at the kitchen counter. Elliot was making dinner, not quite listening, half following an internal debate about whether he'd ordered enough suture materials for Thursday's surgery. "Grandma Lenora asked about you," Maisie said. Elliot turned the heat down on the pan. "Did she?" "She asked Mom if you were doing okay." Maisie considered the apple. "I said you were pretty normal." "That's accurate." She seemed interested. "Maisie, I'm just telling you what happened." She looked up with the particular expression a child who is being scrupulously factual while being fully aware of the implications. "I'm not adding anything." "You don't have to add anything," Elliot said. "You're doing fine without it." Maisie smiled at her apple and said nothing else. Elliot went back to dinner. He was quiet for most of the evening. He told himself repeatedly and with conviction that Lenora Bellamy was someone he had met once at a wedding, that she was 50 years old to his 32, that she was his former wife's mother, that she commanded a billion-dollar company and moved through a world so different from his that any idea of overlap was pure imagination. He told himself all of this. It helped for a while, and then it stopped helping. And that was when Elliot Varden understood that the terrace hadn't been nothing, that the 3 seconds had meant something, and that he was, against every reasonable plan he had made for his life, in real trouble. 6 weeks is long enough to convince yourself that a feeling has passed. Elliot had done the work. He'd gone back to his routines with the deliberate focus of a man who understood that discipline was the only reliable architecture available to him. Early mornings, long shifts, school runs, dinner at the table with Maisie, paperwork after she went to bed. He had not Googled Lenora Bellamy, which he considered a personal victory of some significance. He had not asked Marissa about her, which was harder than it sounded, because Marissa had a particular gift for noticing when Elliot was working not to say something. He had simply absorbed the feeling from the terrace, the way you absorb a bruise, acknowledged it, pressed it once to confirm it was there, and then left it alone to resolve itself. By week 4, he was mostly fine. By week 6, he was almost certain. He had even started running again in the mornings, which was historically his most reliable indicator of psychological equilibrium. When Elliot Varden was running before dawn, things were manageable. When he stopped running, something was wrong. He'd gone a full 3 weeks without lacing up after the wedding. Now he was back at it 4 miles before 6, in the gray-lit quiet before the neighborhood woke up, and he took this as evidence that he had successfully returned to himself. He was wrong, as it turned out. But he wouldn't find that out until a Tuesday evening in October, in the 3rd row of a university lecture hall, when he looked up from his program and saw Lenora Bellamy sitting 8 seats away. The lecture series was something he'd attended irregularly for 2 years, quarterly talks on emerging cardiac research, hosted by the university's medical school and open to the public. Most of the audience were physicians, residents, researchers, occasionally a journalist. Once, memorably, a retired senator who had apparently developed a late-in-life interest in cardiac regeneration after his own bypass surgery, and asked questions with the confident imprecision of a man accustomed to being listened to regardless. Elliot went when the topic was worth the commute. This one was on myocardial regeneration therapies and a clinical trial out of Boston that he'd been following in the journals, so he'd shifted a Thursday evening, left Maisie with Mrs. Garland, and arrived with 10 minutes to spare. He found a seat in the 3rd row, read through the program, and was in the middle of an internal debate about whether the methodology on the Boston trial was going to hold up when he felt something. Not a sound, not a movement, just that particular atmospheric shift that happens when someone nearby is looking at you. He looked up. She was seated 8 chairs down the same row, in a charcoal jacket with her dark hair pulled back, reading her own program with the focused attention she apparently brought to everything. She hadn't looked up yet. She was reading, actually reading, not performing the act of reading while thinking about something else, which was how most people occupied themselves in lecture halls before the speaker started. Elliot sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then Lenora looked up, and their eyes met across 8 empty seats, and she did not look surprised. She looked, and this was the part that stayed with him, afterward, like someone who had just confirmed something they'd already suspected. She gave him a single composed nod. He nodded back. The lights went down. The lecture began. He absorbed about 40% of it. Afterward, in the slow shuffle toward the exits, he almost lost her in the crowd. She was taller than he'd remembered, or maybe he just remembered her differently than she actually was, which was its own kind of problem. He caught the charcoal jacket near the door and said her name before he'd consciously decided to. Lenora, she turned. If she was surprised he'd followed, she didn't show it. Dr. Varden. Elliot. She said it simply, like she was filing it. Did you find the Boston trial data convincing? He blinked. It was not the opening he'd expected. Their sample size is going to be a problem in the long-term follow-up. That's what I thought. She pulled on her coat. The methodology is sound, but they're going to run into statistical noise at the 18-month mark. I read the preliminary paper in March. Elliot stared at her. You read cardiac regeneration journals. I read everything. She said it without self-consciousness, the way people state a preference for black coffee, just a fact about themselves. Architecture, urban planning, medicine, art history. I was a voracious reader before I was a billionaire. The money didn't change that. Why cardiac research specifically? My father had 3 heart attacks before he was 60. She said it evenly, without the particular weight people usually assign to family medical history when they're looking for sympathy. Just information. I decided a long time ago that if I was going to understand something I was afraid of, I should understand it properly. Elliot held the door open. They stepped out into the cool October evening together, and neither of them made any remark about whether this was a coincidence or not, because neither of them believed it was entirely a coincidence, and pointing that out would have made the next 60 seconds awkward. There's a coffee place 2 blocks east, Elliot said. If you don't have somewhere, I don't, Lenora said. They walked. The coffee place was exactly what the neighborhood required it to be. Small, slightly too warm. with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, and the particular ambient noise of a room where people are genuinely having conversations rather than conducting meetings. Elliot ordered black coffee. Lenora ordered tea, looked at the selection for a moment, then changed her mind and ordered coffee as well. "I've been trying to drink less coffee," she said. "It's not going well." "How long have you been trying?" 11 years, he laughed, a real one short and a little caught off guard. "That's a long campaign." "I'm persistent." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "It's the quality that built my company and the quality that will probably outlast every good intention I've ever had." They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and the conversation that followed was not the conversation. Elliot had been half rehearsing in his head since he'd seen her across the lecture hall. It was better than that, and stranger and considerably more disorienting. Because Lenora Bellamy was not what he'd assembled from the facts available to him. Not the composed, controlled executive, not the elegant figure on the terrace, not the 50-year-old billionaire who occupied a world so distant from his that overlap seemed impossible. She was a person. Specifically, she was a person with opinions. Strong ones. Delivered without apology. She thought the city's new waterfront development was an architectural embarrassment. They've spent $400 million making something that will look dated in 8 years. She thought the current trends in hospital design prioritized aesthetics over workflow in ways that were actively harming patient outcomes. "I toured 3 new cardiac units last year, and not one of them had adequate natural light in the recovery." Wing. She had read a biography of Louis Kahn that she considered one of the best books she'd encountered in a decade and was willing to explain why at length to a cardiac surgeon who had never heard of Louis Kahn. "He understood that light isn't decoration," she said. "It's structural. It changes how a space functions at a neurological level. Most architects today treat it like garnish. That sounds like it should matter in hospital design. It should. It mostly doesn't." She took a sip of coffee. "What made you go into cardiac surgery specifically?" The shift was clean. She wasn't deflecting. She was genuinely curious, and the curiosity was direct in the way that Elliot had spent enough time around well-educated people to recognize as rare. Most people ask questions as a social ritual. Lenora asked them because she wanted the answer. "I did a rotation in my second year," he said. "An elderly man came in, massive MI, we almost lost him twice on the table. And when he made it, when I watched his heart stabilize and the numbers come back, I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to fury. That this organ that does everything, every single day, without being asked, can just fail. In an afternoon, it seemed unfair." He paused, which is a strange reason to choose a specialty, but there it is. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "That's not strange," she said. "That's someone who takes things personally when they should. Most doctors would say, you can't afford to take it personally. Most doctors are wrong about that." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "You can't let it consume you. But if you stop caring whether it's fair, you stop being any good at it." He looked at her across the small table and thought, here is someone who has thought carefully about how to do difficult things without becoming hollow doing them. It wasn't a romantic thought. It was something prior to that, a recognition, the kind that happens before you've decided what to do with it. "Tell me about your company," he said. She told him. Not the version that appeared in business profiles and magazine features. Not the carefully edited trajectory of a woman who built a design and real estate firm from a single storefront into a national enterprise, worth more than most people could comfortably imagine. She told him the actual version, which was messier and funnier, and harder than the official one. She had started with a partner who left after 18 months and took half their client list with him. And I want to be fair, I drove him absolutely crazy. I changed direction on 3 major projects in the same quarter because I wasn't satisfied, and he wasn't wrong to be frustrated, and rebuilt from that. She had made a significant acquisition in her mid-40s that her board had unanimously opposed, and that had ultimately doubled the company's value. And she had not said "I told you so" out loud, but she had thought it with great clarity every day for approximately 6 months. She had missed things, not small things. Her first 5 years she had worked so relentlessly that she had memories of Marissa at 8, and then sort of fragmentary images of Marissa at 11, and then suddenly Marissa was 13 and opinionated, and the gap in between was something Lenora still thought about in the particular way you think about something you can't go back and fix. "She doesn't hold it against you," Elliot said. He said it carefully, because it was true and he knew it was true, but he also knew it wasn't the same as saying it hadn't cost anything. "She's generous about it." Lenora looked at her coffee. That's her character, not my absolution. Something about the precision of that sentence, the refusal to give herself more credit than was accurate, made Elliot like her, in a way that was distinct from everything else he'd been feeling. It was the kind of honesty that was genuinely hard. Not the performed kind, where people confess minor flaws to seem self-aware. The actual kind, where you name something that hurts and don't dress it up. Can I ask you something? He said. You can try. At the wedding, when I said, he stopped. Started again. You weren't surprised when I said what I said. You weren't surprised at all. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car went past, its headlights sweeping briefly across the window. No, she said, I wasn't. Did you already know I was going to say something? I suspected you might say something, she said. I didn't know it would be that honest. A pause. It's unusual. Most people manage the moment. Find a way to retreat into something safer. I should have, Elliot said. Probably. She held his gaze. I'm not sure I wanted you to. The coffee shop noise continued around them. The grinder behind the counter, two people at the next table, arguing pleasantly about something on their laptop, the door opening and closing. Ordinary evening sounds. And in the middle of all of it, Elliot sat with the feeling of a man who has been walking carefully along what he believed was solid ground, and has just noticed that the ground has been moving beneath him this whole time. We should be realistic, he said. About what specifically? He gestured slightly. At the situation, at the space between them, at the 18 years and the former marriage and the $1 billion and all the rest of it. Lenora looked at him with an expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite challenge. I'm always realistic, she said. I haven't suggested anything. I know. Then what are you trying to say? Elliot was quiet for a second. I don't know, he admitted. I think I'm telling myself to be careful while simultaneously being very bad at it. That, Lenora said, is the most honest thing you've said so far. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. They sat for another 20 minutes talking about something else entirely. A public library renovation project she'd been consulted on. The particular challenge of preserving structural integrity in buildings not designed to accommodate modern technical infrastructure. And when they finally stood and put on their coats, it was past 10 o'clock and neither of them had noticed the time going. Outside, they paused on the sidewalk. I don't usually, Elliot started. I know, she said. This isn't how I... Elliot. Her voice was patient without being condescending. You're not doing anything wrong. He nodded. Can I give you my number? She said. He looked at her. Yes, she told him. He typed it into his phone. They walked in opposite directions. He had gone half a block when he realized he was smiling, and stopped to examine that fact for a moment, and then kept walking because there was nothing else to do about it. He didn't call for 11 days. This was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference, which was the problem. He would pick up the phone and look at the number and think about all the reasons this was a complicated idea. And the list of reasons was genuinely long and genuinely valid. And none of it was enough to make him delete the contact he'd saved under simply L. Bellamy, which was so deliberately neutral, it was almost embarrassing. On the 12th day, a Saturday, he texted instead. There's a talk on historic preservation at the Arts Institute next Friday evening. I have no particular reason to mention this. Her response came 22 minutes later. I'll be there, and you have an obvious reason. You're just being careful about stating it. He stared at that for a while. Then he typed, Is being careful a problem? Her answer came back in under a minute. Depends on how long it goes on. He put his phone down. He picked it up again. He typed, Friday at 6. 6, she sent back. Don't be late. I hate waiting. He was early. The talks became a pattern before either of them explicitly agreed that they would. Historic preservation one Friday. A gallery exhibition the following week, a retrospective of a mid-century architect whose work Lenora knew in detail and Elliot knew almost nothing about. So he asked questions, and she answered them with the focused enthusiasm of someone who has spent 20 years caring about something that most people in her world never think about. He began to understand that for Lenora, buildings were not inventory or investments, or not primarily that. They were records. Evidence of what people had valued at a particular moment in time, and what they'd built to outlast themselves. This one, she said, pausing in front of a photograph of a library in a small Ohio town, was scheduled for demolition in 1987. Local Historical Society raised $60,000 in 8 weeks to stop it. Did they? They did. She looked at the photograph, the building's sandstone facade, its arched windows, the modest dignity of something built to serve a public purpose. It's still there, completely restored. The card catalog is on display in the reading room. You've been there. I've been to every building in this exhibition. She said it without self-consciousness. When I'm researching a restoration project, I want to understand what was worth saving. Not in theory, in practice. Elliot stood beside her and looked at the photograph of the Ohio Library and thought about what it meant to spend your life fighting for things that other people had given up on. Is that what you're doing with the school? He said, turned to look at him. Which school? Marissa mentioned it once before the wedding. An old building you were looking at. Something you wanted to restore. Lenora studied him. She told you about that? In passing. She didn't have details. A pause. Would you want to see it? It was a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later, when Lenora picked him up in a car that was not quite ostentatious but was unquestionably expensive. The kind of vehicle that announced its quality quietly, through the precision of its door mechanism and the particular quality of silence inside it, and drove him 40 minutes outside the city to a neighborhood that was somewhere between declining and beginning, which was apparently exactly where Lenora Bellamy looked when she was searching for something worth saving. The building sat on a corner lot behind a rusted chain-link fence. It had been a Schoolscene elementary school, he gathered, built sometime in the early 20th century, and it had the bone structure of something that had been built with real intention. Limestone facade, tall windows, a roofline that still had its original pitch. Whatever had happened to it in the decades since, the boarded windows, the graffiti on the lower walls, the section of fencing someone had pulled back and never repaired, hadn't reached the actual bones of the building. It was still there, still standing, still recognizable as something that had once mattered. Lenora had a key to the padlock. She opened it without ceremony. Inside, the smell was cold dust and old plaster, and something vaguely organic he couldn't identify and didn't want to examine too closely. The main hallway was broad and high-ceilinged, with original tile on the floor, cracked in places but mostly intact, a deep amber and green pattern that was somehow still beautiful under the grime. Classroom doors stood open at intervals. At the far end of the hall, a staircase with a wooden banister led to the upper floor. And above the staircase, in the ceiling of the entrance hall, was a skylight. It was cracked. One pane was missing entirely and had been covered with a sheet of plastic that had since gone opaque with age. But its structure was still there, a grid of iron and glass, octagonal, positioned to send light down the center of the building. Even on a gray afternoon in November, what light came through it fell in a column that hit the center of the amber and green tile floor like something deliberate. That's the original skylight, Lenora said. She was standing beside him, looking up. It's cracked. 3 panes, the rest are sound. She folded her arms. The iron framework is original and completely intact. We'd restore the missing pane, replace the cracked ones with matching glass. The whole ceiling of this hall would flood with light again. What are you going to do with it? She walked forward into the column of gray November light. Community Arts Center. Free programming. Classes in visual art, music, design for kids, for adults. A gallery space in the upper hall. Studio space in the former classrooms. She turned to look at him. There's nothing like it within 4 miles. The neighborhood had 3 arts programs. All 3 lost funding in the last 8 years. Elliot walked slowly down the hallway, running one hand along the tile. Up close, the damage was more extensive than the entrance had suggested. Water stains on the plaster ceiling, a section of floor where the boards had warped and separated, a classroom on the left where the window frames had rotted through. It wasn't a building that could be saved with enthusiasm and good intentions. It was a serious project, the kind that would take years. Your board supports this, he said. It's being funded through my foundation, not the company. A pause. My board is not always consulted on foundation decisions. Smart. I have my moments. She was watching him look at the building. What do you think? He stopped near the foot of the staircase and looked up at the skylight again. The cracked panes, the missing glass, the iron framework still holding its geometry after a century of indifference. Good bones, he said. He meant it about the building. He turned to say something else, and found Lenora 3 feet closer than she'd been a moment ago. Close enough that the distance between them was no longer casual. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Something quieter than her usual composure. Something that was still composed, but underneath the composure was something warmer, less managed. Good bones, she said quietly. He knew in that moment that neither of them was talking entirely about the building. The afternoon light came down through the cracked skylight and hit the old tile floor between them, and the cold air of the empty hallway was very still. and Elliot was close enough to see the exact quality of her expression and understand what it was. Not an invitation, not quite, but not a barrier either. Something in between. Something that was waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He leaned forward. She didn't move away. They were a breath apart. And then Lenora took one deliberate step back. "Not yet," she said. Her voice was even. Not regretful, not apologetic. Clear Elliot straightened, took a breath. "Okay," he said. "I mean it," she said. "It's not," she paused. Looked for the words. "There are things that should be said before something changes. There are people this involves. I need to do this correctly." "I understand," he said. "You're not angry." "No." He looked at her. "Should I be?" Something crossed her face, something brief and genuine. Most men would be. Most men don't have Maisie explaining their emotional responses to them every other evening, Elliot said. "I've been trained to think before I react." Lenora looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed. The real one. The same short, surprised sound from the terrace, and the tension in the hallway shifted into something warmer and more human. They walked through the rest of the building together, and she showed him what she was planning. Classroom by classroom. She had floor plans in a folder she'd brought, annotated in her handwriting dents, precise notes in the margins about materials and timelines, and which contractors had the specific expertise for limestone restoration. She had clearly been planning this for a long time. The detail of it was serious in the way that Lenora Bellamy was serious about things. Not performing thoroughness, actually doing it. They walked out into the late afternoon and stood by the car while she locked the gate, and the neighborhood around them was quiet in the specific way of places that are between one thing and another, waiting. "Thank you for showing me," Elliot said. "Thank you for not pretending it wasn't interesting." She handed the padlock key to her driver, who had materialized with the precise timing of someone professionally invisible. A lot of people would have been polite about it. "It's a genuinely interesting building." "I know." She looked at him. "You said good bones? It has good bones." "Yes." Her expression did something he was starting to recognize, a slight shift, barely visible in the set of her eyes. The micro version of whatever she showed the world when something actually mattered to her. "It does." He got into his car, his 7-year-old practical car parked behind hers, and drove home through the early November dark. And something had changed. He knew it. She knew it. They had not kissed, had not made any agreement, had not said anything that couldn't be walked back. But when he drove away from that building, from the cracked skylight and the amber-green tile and the space in the cold hallway where they'd stood a breath apart, he understood that not yet was not the same as no. It wasn't the same thing at all. He drove home, made dinner, helped Maisie with a school project about migratory birds that turned into an hour-long tangent about whether birds had opinions about where they went, and by 8:30 he was sitting in the quiet of the living room after she'd gone to bed. And he allowed himself, for the first time since the wedding, to think about all of this without immediately talking himself out of it. Lenora had said not yet, because she was careful about doing things correctly. That was not a quality he could argue against. He was a man who had built his entire life on being careful, on doing things correctly, on understanding that the people around him deserved consideration before he acted on what he wanted. And what he wanted, he finally admitted sitting in his quiet living room, with the remnants of a migratory bird project on the coffee table and the sound of Maisie's breathing through the baby monitor. He still kept on the shelf out of habit, even though she was 7. Had told him approximately 40 times that she didn't need it. What he wanted was a future in which Lenora Bellamy was somehow part of the shape of things. He didn't know what that looked like. He didn't know if it was possible. He knew it was the truth. The months that followed were the strangest of Elliot Varden's adult life, and not because anything dramatic happened in them. Quite the opposite. They were strange because of how ordinary they felt, and how that ordinariness kept catching him off guard. He and Lenora did not date, exactly. They did not label what they were doing, or have a conversation about what it meant. What they did was continue the lectures, the galleries, the coffee that lasted too long, the walks through neighborhoods she was researching, or buildings she was considering. They texted with a frequency that Elliot suspected would have alarmed him if he'd examined it directly, so he chose not to examine it. He simply answered when she wrote, and wrote when he thought of something, which turned out to be often. She sent him an article about a study linking hospital lighting conditions to post-surgical recovery rates, with no comment attached. He sent her a photograph of a cracked ceiling tile in the hospital's east wing that had been there for 7 months, despite 3 maintenance requests, because it reminded him of something she'd said about institutional indifference to infrastructure. She responded with a single line, "That tile is a moral failure." He had laughed at his phone in the middle of a hallway and received a concerned look from a passing resident. Maisie, who noticed everything, said nothing specific. She had apparently decided, in the manner of 7-year-olds operating on information they've gathered through methods their parents don't fully understand, that the situation would resolve itself, and her job was to observe. She did ask once, while Elliot was packing her lunch, whether Grandma Lenora was nice. "She's very direct," Elliot said. "Is that the same as nice?" "In her case, I think so." Maisie considered this with the seriousness she gave most things. "Does she like you?" "I think so," Elliot said. "Good." Maisie zipped her backpack. "You need more people who like you. Mrs. Garland doesn't count because she's paid to be there. Mrs. Garland genuinely likes me. She likes your coffee maker. It's different." He did not pursue this line of conversation further. What was harder to ignore was the accumulating weight of what they were not saying. Every time Elliot and Lenora spent an evening together, the conversation moved deeper, and the silences between topics became more comfortable, and the particular charged quality that had existed between them, since the terrace, did not diminish with familiarity the way he'd half hoped it would. If anything, it intensified, became more specific. He knew now the exact way she held her coffee mug when she was thinking through something difficult. He knew that she became very still when she disagreed with someone and hadn't decided yet whether to say so. He knew she had a preference for sitting with her back to walls in restaurants, which she attributed to years of business dinners where she needed to see who was arriving, and he suspected was also just a preference she'd had since childhood that she'd retrofitted a practical explanation onto. She knew that he got quieter, not louder, when he was frustrated. She knew he checked his phone for Maisie's texts at approximately 9:30 on the evenings Maisie was with Marissa, with the specific anxiety of a parent who knew intellectually that everything was fine and couldn't quite make the rest of himself believe it. She knew he had an opinion about coffee that he was too polite to impose on other people, but that expressed itself in the barely perceptible pause before he drank from a cup that hadn't been made the way he'd make it himself. They knew each other, was the thing. Not completely, not the way years build knowing, but enough that being with her had started to feel less like discovery and more like returning to something. And that was the part he couldn't rationalize away, because it wasn't the flutter of attraction or the intrigue of novelty. It was steadier than that, and more unsettling. December came in hard and gray, the kind of winter that arrives without the decency of a single photogenic snowfall and simply settles into a permanent damp cold that makes the city feel tired. Elliot's caseload increased. It always did this time of year, when people who'd been ignoring symptoms through the fall finally stopped ignoring them, and the stress of the season pressed down on cardiovascular systems that had been managing by the thinnest of margins. He did 3 emergency procedures in the first 2 weeks of December alone. He and Lenora found time where they could. A Sunday afternoon at a bookshop she liked in the east part of the city. A Thursday evening that started as dinner and turned into a 2-mile walk because neither of them wanted to be done with the conversation yet. She was deep in the planning phase of the school restoration by now, managing contractors and permits and a preservation board review that she described with the controlled intensity of someone who had learned to channel frustration into precision rather than noise. The board's concern is the skylight framework, she told him one evening over dinner at a small Italian place she'd chosen because nobody there would recognize her. He'd learned, a mental map of the city organized partly by where she could eat without being approached. They want to replace it entirely with a modern equivalent. Structurally safer, they say. Cheaper to maintain. But it's not the same thing. She set down her fork. A modern replacement would be structurally adequate and aesthetically dead. The original ironwork has a curvature to it, a slight convex curve in each panel that scatters the light differently than flat glass would. That's not an accident. Whoever designed that building understood exactly what they were doing. A replacement loses that entirely. Can you get an engineer to certify the original? I have 2. They disagree. She picked up her fork again. I'm getting a 3rd. What happens if the 3rd disagrees too? Then I'll get a 4th. She said it with complete matter-of-factness, as though this were an obvious and unremarkable position. The building has waited this long. It can wait for a correct answer. He looked at her across the restaurant table, this woman who would commission a 4th structural engineer without blinking because she refused to accept a conclusion that felt wrong to her, and he felt something that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite exasperation, and was in fact just a very specific kind of affection for a person who was exactly who they were, unapologetically and at some cost. "Lenora," he said. She looked up. "I want to say something, and I'm not sure how to say it." She set her fork down again, deliberately this time. "Then, say it the way you know how. I think about you more than is," he stopped. "More than I know what to do with. And I know you said not yet. I know there are things that need to be handled first. I'm not pushing against that. He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know that for me this is not casual. It hasn't been casual since the terrace. Maybe before that. I don't know." Lenora was quiet for a moment. The restaurant hummed around them. "I know," she said. "That's all, you know. What did you want me to say?" He exhaled. "Something that told me whether this is mutual or whether It's mutual." She said it directly, with no decoration. "It's been mutual for longer than is entirely comfortable for me to admit." A pause. "I'm not a woman who falls into things, Elliot. I think before I move, I assess. I've been assessing since the terrace. And I'm still here," she said simply. "That's the assessment." He looked at her. "That's enough for me." "Good." She picked up her fork again. "Then eat your dinner. It's getting cold." It was 3 weeks before Christmas when things finally cracked open. Not in a crisis, not in an argument. In the particular quiet of a city night, when the streets are empty enough that your footsteps sound different, more present, more specific, and the cold air is sharp enough to make everything feel more awake than it actually is. They had been to a reception, a foundation event that Lenora had an obligation to attend, and had asked if Elliot wanted to accompany her. It was the first time they'd appeared somewhere together that wasn't definitively classified as just two people who knew each other. The invitation itself had been phrased casually, in a text that simply said "Foundation Dinner Thursday. Full of people I have to talk to and don't particularly want to. Come if you can tolerate it." And Elliot had said yes before he'd thought too carefully about what yes implied. What it implied became apparent about 20 minutes after they arrived, when a woman in her 60s with a board position, and the particular social acuity of someone who had built a career on reading rooms correctly, looked between Elliot and Lenora, and then looked again, and then gave Lenora a smile that contained an entire conversation inside it, and Lenora perceived it with the composed stillness of someone who had expected it and had decided how to handle it. She didn't hide. She didn't explain. She introduced Elliot by name, said he was a cardiac surgeon, and let the room make its own calculations. It was, he thought, exactly the right move. Not an announcement, not a denial, simply a refusal to perform in either direction. He talked to a man who ran an urban planning nonprofit and found him genuinely interesting. He ate food that was considerably better than the foundation dinner food he'd been mentally bracing for. He watched Lenora work the room, not with the performing quality of someone selling something, but with the specific efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades and had long since stopped needing to use more energy than the situation required. She was good at it, formidably good, and she clearly did not particularly enjoy it. Twice across the evening, she caught his eye from across the room, and both times there was a brief expression. Not quite a grimace, not quite a smile, something in between that said, "Yes, I know." 10 more minutes the way people telegraph these things to each other when they've developed the shorthand. He wasn't sure she knew she was doing it. He wasn't sure he knew what it meant that he understood it. They left at 9:30 and walked. It was the natural thing to do. The venue was in the older part of the city. The streets were quiet, and neither of them had said anything beyond good. "Let's go," when he'd raised his eyebrows toward the exit, and she'd agreed. They walked north, then east, following no particular route, talking about the evening who she'd had to talk to and why, a grant decision that had been more complicated than it should have been, the urban planning man Elliot had met, whose work she apparently respected and whose last funding application she'd approved without hesitation. The cold was serious now. December had finally committed. Their breath made small clouds in the lamplight, and the streets were mostly empty in the way of weeknight city streets, occasional cars, a couple walking ahead of them, a restaurant with its lights still on, and a handful of people visible through the window. They turned without discussing it onto a street that led toward the river, and when they reached the bridge, an old stone one, pedestrian access on both sides, iron railing worn smooth by decades of hands, Lenora stopped and leaned against the railing and looked out at the water. Elliot stopped beside her. The river below was dark and moving, picking up the city lights in long fractured reflections. The bridge's stone was cold under his gloved hand. Somewhere further along the bank, A string of lights had been strung through the bare trees in some approximation of seasonal decoration, and their reflection ran in broken colors across the water's surface. They were quiet for a while. Then Lenora said, "There's something I want to say, and I've been deciding whether to say it." "When have you ever not said something once you'd decided on it?" "Fair." She was still looking at the water. "I've been thinking about Marissa." Elliot didn't say anything. He waited. Not with doubt," Lenora said, with the particular care of someone choosing exact words. "I'm past doubt about this. I've been past it for a while, if I'm honest. What I've been thinking is, she needs to hear this from me before anything changes. She paused. If whatever this is becomes something we're not managing carefully anymore. You mean before we stop pretending it isn't what it is?" She looked at him. "Yes, that's what I mean." The water moved below them. A car crossed the bridge at the far end, its headlights briefly illuminating the stone. "There's an age gap," Lenora said, 18 years. "I don't say that as though it's a problem I haven't solved. I say it because it exists, and pretending it doesn't insults both of us. People will have thoughts about it. Some of them will say things." She turned to face him more fully. "I have never in my professional life made a major decision based on what people might say about it. I'm not going to start now, but I want you to have thought about it, really thought about it. Not the version where you decide it doesn't matter, because the feeling is strong enough. I know that version. I know how convincing it is in the moment. I mean the version 5 years from now when someone makes a remark at a dinner table, and you have to decide what to do with it." "I've thought about it," Elliot said. "How long?" "Longer than I've admitted to you." He looked at her steadily. "I'm a cardiac surgeon. I'm 32. I've had patients in their 70s tell me the biggest regret of their life was the thing they talked themselves out of because they were worried about what it looked like from the outside. I've heard that from enough of them that I take it seriously." He paused. "The age gap is real. I'm not minimizing it, but it's not the thing that scares me." "What scares you?" He was quiet for a moment because the answer was honest and he wanted to get it right. "Marissa," he said. "Not losing her. I don't think we'd lose her. But hurting her in some way that's invisible and permanent. Her watching her mother and her ex-husband and feeling something she can't name, even if she says it's fine." He looked at Lenora. "She's a good person. She'd give us her blessing before she'd let herself be complicated about it. I don't want her to do that at cost to herself." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. The river moved. The city breathed around them. "I noticed you before you noticed me," she said. Elliot went still. At the reception, she said, "You think you noticed me on the terrace when you came out for air, but I saw you earlier. An hour earlier, maybe more." She shifted slightly, turning to face the water again, not from discomfort, but with the quality of someone who speaks more easily about important things when they're not looking directly at the listener. "I watched you watching Marissa and Caleb during the first dance. And what I saw," she paused. "You were happy, actually happy. Not performing happiness, not making peace with something grudgingly. You looked at your ex-wife dancing with your best friend, and you were genuinely glad for them." Elliot didn't respond. "I've known men who couldn't manage that," Lenora said. "Men younger than you. Men who've had twice the time to arrive at something like acceptance. And you were 32 years old, and you'd shown up at the wedding, and you were clapping at the right moments, and you weren't pretending." She glanced at him. "That's not common. He stopped. "The marriage ended because we weren't right for each other. That's not her failure or mine. It's just what happened. I know that's what you believe. That's the part that's uncommon." She turned to face him fully. "I'd been watching you for an hour before you walked onto that terrace. So when you told me the dress was beautiful," a brief pause, "I already knew what kind of man I was looking at. I knew before you said a word." The quiet between them had a different quality now. Not the silence of things unspoken, something fuller than that. Something that had been built slowly, over months of lectures and coffee and cold walks, and a cracked skylight and an 11-day wait before he texted, and a dinner table where she'd told him it's mutual and meant every syllable. "Can I ask you something?" Elliot said. "Yes. When you said not yet in the building, did you mean not yet because you needed to handle things first? Or did you mean not yet because you weren't sure?" Lenora considered this for exactly the amount of time she needed to consider it. "Both," she said, in the beginning. Less and less the second reason as time went on. She looked at him with an expression he'd been learning to read, the one she kept underneath the composure, the one that showed up in the moments when she decided to let it. "I'm sure now," she said. Elliot turned to face her. They were standing close in the way of two people who have spent months gradually closing the distance between them, each increment deniable on its own, and unmistakable in aggregate. The cold was sharp. The stone railing was solid under his hand. The city moved around them in its quiet Thursday night rhythm, indifferent and encompassing. "Can I kiss you?" he said. It came out steadier than he felt. Lenora held his gaze. 1 second, 2, 3. The 3 seconds had become a kind of private language between them by now. The beat she took before she said anything that mattered. He'd learned not to fill it. He'd learned to wait for what came after. "Yes," she said. He kissed her. It was gentle the first one. Careful in the way first things between people are careful, when there's enough at stake to want it to be right. Her hand came up to the lapel of his coat, and the contact was small but certain, and the cold air was all around them, and the river moved below. The second kiss was different. The second one carried everything that the first one had been holding back months of it. The gallery on a Thursday evening, and the coffee place that was too warm, and the cracked skylight, and the terrace in summer, and the 3 seconds on a stone bridge in December. And when they pulled apart, they were both very still for a moment, adjusting to the altered landscape. "Okay," Lenora said quietly. "Yeah," Elliot said. She was still holding his lapel. She looked down at her own hand as if noticing this, and released it with a kind of deliberateness that wasn't withdrawal, just the natural completion of a gesture. "I meant what I said," she told him. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it that he'd never quite heard in her before. Warmth that hadn't been edited. "We don't hide. I won't do it. Not from Marissa, not from anyone. I wouldn't ask you to." "I know," she looked at him. "I'm not saying it because I think you'd ask me to. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that, before this goes any further, I will talk to her. Myself. Not a phone call in person. I'll tell her what this is, and let her respond however she needs to respond." A pause. "It may be difficult. She may need time, I know," Elliot said. "It might complicate things with Maisie." "I know that too." "You're not worried?" He was quiet for a moment. Honestly quiet, not performing steadiness. "I'm worried about Maisie in the specific way I'm always worried about Maisie, which is constant and low grade and not going anywhere regardless of this conversation." He looked at Lenora. "But Maisie is 7. She's resilient in ways I don't fully understand yet, and she's already asked me whether you're nice. I think she's further along in processing this than either of us." Something crossed Lenora's face, a surprise, quickly succeeded by something that might have been moved if she'd allowed herself that word. "She asked about me? Months ago." He paused. "She also told me, Mrs. Garland only likes me for my coffee maker." Lenora made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. She might not be wrong. They stood on the bridge for another few minutes, talking less now. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was comfortable in a way that felt earned. The river carried its broken reflections. The bare trees with their string of lights swayed slightly in the wind. When they finally started walking back, Lenora didn't move to put distance between them, and Elliot matched her pace without thinking about it. At a corner where their routes diverged, her car was west. He was walking east toward where he'd parked. She stopped. "Elliot." He turned. "When I talked to Marissa, she said, I don't know what she's going to say. I think she'll be generous about it. I know my daughter, but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that it goes wrong before it goes right. I know, and I want you to know that it doesn't change my answer. If she's upset, we give her time. We don't hide and we don't rush her. But my answer doesn't change." He looked at her in the lamplight. Her coat was dark against the pale stone of the building behind her, and she was looking at him with the full directness she normally rationed carefully. "Mine either," he said. She nodded, one firm, precise nod, the way she concluded things she was settled about. "Good night, Elliot. Good night." He walked east through the cold December city, and he did not try to predict what Marissa would say, or when the conversation would happen, or what shape the next weeks would take. He walked and thought about the bridge and the river, and the way Lenora had said yes after 3 seconds, and about the fact that she had been watching him for an hour before he'd walked out onto that terrace, and he'd never known it. He thought about a man who had watched his ex-wife marry his best friend and been genuinely glad. He thought about a woman who had seen that and decided it meant something. He wondered what Maisie would say when she found out her read on the situation had been correct months ago. Buck. Knowing Maisie, she would be precise and restrained about it. She would also definitely say, "I told you so." He was almost smiling when he found his car, and the drive home was quiet in the way of a man who has just had the night reconfigured around him and hasn't finished taking stock of the altered geography yet, but who is not, underneath any of it, afraid. He was a cardiac surgeon. He spent his days holding other people's hearts together. He was fairly certain he understood by now, how fragile they were, and how much, when handled with the right kind of care, they could survive. He drove home through the December dark, and the city lights moved across the windshield in streaks of gold and white. And somewhere across town, a woman with a composed face and a habit of 3-second silences was making a decision about a phone call that would either open a door or complicate one. And Elliot found, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he was not afraid of what was coming. He was simply waiting to see what came next. That was new. That was, he thought, enough. The 4 days after the bridge were the longest of Elliot's recent memory, and they were long in the specific way of waiting for something you can't control. Not anxious exactly, but hyperware, the way the air feels different before a storm that may or may not arrive. He knew Lenora would call when she was ready. He knew she would not be rushed and would not rush herself, and that the conversation with Marissa would happen on Lenora's timeline, because that was simply how Lenora operated deliberately without shortcuts. He respected that. He had told her he respected that. He meant it. That didn't make the 4 days shorter. He worked. He operated on a 61-year-old man whose aortic valve had been quietly failing for 2 years, while the man had been telling himself the fatigue was stress, and the surgery went well, and afterward Elliot sat in the scrub room for 10 minutes longer than he needed to, because he was having a conversation with himself about patience that he was not entirely winning. He did school pickup. He helped Maisie with a project on ecosystems that somehow became a 45-minute argument about whether a coral reef counted as one organism or many, which he lost, which was becoming a pattern. He ran in the mornings. He slept poorly, which was not unusual given his schedule, but felt more pointed than usual. He did not text Lenora. She had something significant to do, and she didn't need him hovering at the edge of it. On the third evening, his phone buzzed while he was washing dishes after dinner, and his stomach did a thing that he chose not to examine too carefully. But it was Caleb just checking in, asking if Elliot was coming to a thing the hospital's research department was hosting in January. Elliot answered and set the phone down and went back to the dishes. Maisie appeared at the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, which she was not supposed to be in yet, because it was 7:15 and bedtime was 8. "You look weird," she said. "I'm washing dishes." "You look weird while washing dishes." She came in and climbed onto the counter stool. "Is it the Lenora thing?" Elliot turned off the tap and turned around. "What do you know about a Lenora thing?" Maisie looked at him with the expression she had inherited from no one he could identify. A kind of patient, slightly tired look, as though she was regularly required to explain obvious things to capable adults. "Dad, I'm 7, not 4. What does that mean?" "It means I can tell when you're waiting for your phone to do something." She pulled her knees up to her chest on the stool. "Is she going to call?" "Maybe. I don't know. Is it a good maybe or a scary maybe?" Elliot considered this. "I'm not sure yet." Maisie nodded slowly. "I told Mom I liked her," she said. "Grandma Lenora." "I told Mom she seemed interesting." Elliot stared at his daughter. "When did you tell Marissa that?" "Last weekend." Maisie was examining a spot on the counter with sudden interest. "Mom asked if I'd seen her lately, and I said no, but you talked about her sometimes. And I said I thought she seemed interesting from what you said." "I don't talk about her." "You do a little." Maisie looked up. "You don't know you do it." He stood in his kitchen on a Tuesday night looking at his 7-year-old daughter perched on the counter stool in her unauthorized pajamas, and he felt something vast and complicated and entirely unschedulable move through his chest. "What did Marissa say?" he asked. His voice came out careful. "She said." Maisie paused, with the precision of a child retrieving an exact quote. "She said interesting is a good word for her." A pause. Then she smiled. Not her regular smile. The one she does when something is more complicated than she's going to say out loud. Elliot said nothing for a moment. "Okay," he said.
"Okay."
Maisie agreed, and hopped off the stool and went back to her room, apparently satisfied that the information had been successfully delivered. The call came on the 4th day, a Thursday, at 6:40 in the evening. He was in the living room with a journal article open on his lap that he had been reading the same paragraph of for the past 20 minutes. When his phone screen lit up with L. Bellamy, his first thought was that his heart did something that he, as a cardiac surgeon, could identify with technical precision and had no clinical term adequate to describe. He answered, "Lenora, Elliot." A beat, but not one of her assessment beats. Shorter. "I talked to her." "How did it go?" A pause that told him something before she spoke. "She cried," Lenora said. Not in the way you're worried about. Not angry crying. He could hear her choosing words carefully. "She sat very still for about 30 seconds, and then she cried. And I have not seen my daughter cry like that since her grandfather's funeral, which worried me. So I asked her what she was feeling, and she said she didn't know yet. Elliot pressed the phone against his ear. Outside, a car went past. The house was quiet. "Then what?" he said. Then she asked me to tell her how it happened. Not the facts. She said she didn't need a timeline. She asked me how it felt. Lenora's voice was steady, but he could hear something underneath it. I told her the truth. That I'd seen a man at her wedding who seemed to have made his peace with something most people spend years being bitter about. That I'd found him interesting before he said a word to me. That it had happened slowly, and I had been careful about it, and that I'd been waiting until I was certain before I told her. What did she say? Another pause, longer this time. She sat there for a little while, Lenora said. Then she asked me one question. He waited. She asked, "Does he make you feel like yourself?" The question settled over Elliot in the quiet living room, and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. Not to that question, not to the image of Marissa sitting across from her mother and finding that particular thing to ask. I told her yes, Lenora said. And she said, Lenora's voice shifted. Fractionally. An adjustment Elliot wouldn't have caught 3 months ago, but could now read clearly. She said she needed a day, and then she called me this afternoon. Today? About 2 hours ago, a breath. She said she knows you're a good father. She said she knows the marriage ended and that both of you moved forward genuinely and that she has known that for a long time. And she said a pause. She said she wasn't going to make two people she loved feel guilty because their happiness arrived in an unexpected form. Elliot closed his eyes for a second. She gave us her blessing, Lenora said. He sat with that for a moment. The journal article slid off his lap onto the cushion beside him, and he didn't notice. How is she? He said. Not the blessing part, how is she actually? She's complicated, Lenora said. She's generous enough to mean what she said, and honest enough to know it's still complicated. She told me she might need some time before she could be around both of us together. That's fair. That's more than fair. A beat. She loves you, Elliot. Not romantically, that ended a long time ago, and she knows it. But she loves you as Maisie's father, and as someone she's known for almost a decade. She wants you to be okay. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the quiet street outside the neighbor's porch light, the bare tree in the yard, the ordinary Thursday evening geography of his life. She's remarkable, he said. Yes, Lenora said, she is a pause. So is her daughter. Yeah. Silence. But the good kind, the kind between two people who have just come through something and are on the same side of it. Lenora. Yes. Thank you for doing it right. A pause. It was the only way I was going to do it. Her voice was composed, but the composure was warmer than its usual temperature.
Are you all right?
I think so. He leaned his shoulder against the window frame. I feel like something just changed. Several things just changed.
Yeah.
He was quiet for a moment. Can I take you to dinner on Saturday? Not as two people carefully not labeling what they are. Not as that, he said, a 3-second pause. Saturday, she said. The dinner on Saturday was at a restaurant Elliot picked. Not her territory, not a place she'd chosen for its anonymity or its geography, relative to people who might recognize her. A place he liked, that he'd been to with Caleb, and once with his mother when she'd visited. It was busy and not particularly quiet, and the food was reliably good, and he made a reservation under his own name and did not second-guess any of it. They sat across from each other in a booth toward the back, not because they were hiding, but because Elliot preferred booths. And she had adapted to this preference with the quiet accommodation of someone who's noted it without commenting. They had, he realized early in the evening, arrived at something that required no management. The careful calibration of the previous months, the precise attention to what was said and unsaid, the navigation of what they were and were not, had resolved into something simpler. They talked. They disagreed about whether the restaurant's wine list was overpriced for the quality, which it was, which she acknowledged, while ordering a second glass anyway. She told him about a contractor dispute on the school project that had resulted in a 3-hour meeting she described with the controlled fury of someone who has had 30 years of practice not visibly losing her temper. He told her about the Tuesday surgery, the 61-year-old man, and she listened the way she always listened, with the full attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply respond. Did he know how serious it was? She asked, before he came in. He suspected. He just kept moving the deadline for dealing with it. Why? Because dealing with it was terrifying, and being tired was something he could live with. She looked at him steadily. That's not logical. Fear isn't logical. Fear is just fear. He turned his wine glass. Most of the patients I've had who came in too late didn't come in too late because they didn't know something was wrong. They came in too late because knowing something was wrong required them to do something about it. Lenora was quiet for a moment. That applies to more than medicine. Yes. She looked at him. Is that a pointed observation? It's a general one. He met her eyes. That also applies to me. The restaurant was warm and busy around them. The particular noise of a weekend evening, overlapping conversations, the clink of glasses, a table nearby celebrating something with a cake that appeared briefly in a server's arms. And in the middle of all of it, Elliot and Lenora sat in their booth and looked at each other with the clear, direct quality of two people who have decided to stop managing and simply be. I want to say something, Elliot said. You've been building to it for about 10 minutes, Lenora said. Is it that obvious? You do a thing with your water glass when you're organizing a thought. She looked composed and slightly amused and not unkind. What thing? Quarter turned to the left. Twice. She demonstrated in the air. It's consistent. He stared at her. I've never noticed that. I know. That's why it's useful information. She folded her hands on the table. Say what you want to say. I want to stop handling this like a problem to be solved, he said. I've been since the terrace. I've been treating this like something that required careful management. Careful enough that it almost took too long. He looked at her. I don't want to be careful in that way anymore. I want to be whatever this actually is. What do you think this actually is, she said. He didn't hesitate. Something that matters. Something I don't want to be at the edge of anymore. Lenora looked at him for a moment. Not the 3-second assessment. Just looking. Then don't be at the edge of it, she said. I told you in December that my answer doesn't change. I meant it. He reached across the table. She looked down at his hand and then she put hers in it, and neither of them said anything about it, because there wasn't anything to say. It was simply the natural completion of something that had been finding its way to this moment, since a summer terrace and a sentence about a dress. What followed was not a transformation. It was more gradual than that, and more human. They didn't arrive at some clean new arrangement overnight. Lenora's life was what it was, demanding and complex, and structured around a company that did not pause because she'd reached a personal milestone. Elliot's life was what it was: early mornings, long surgeries, school runs, homework at the kitchen table, the specific and non-negotiable rhythm of raising a child who was the organizing principle of everything else. These lives did not simply merge. They found each other carefully in the available spaces, and the available spaces were fewer and more irregular than either of them might have arranged in an ideal version. She called him from airports, occasionally. She had a habit of calling during layover shorter trips for work, back in a day or two. And the calls were rarely about anything important, which made them feel very important. They talked about whatever was present, the meeting she'd just left, a cardiology paper he'd been reading, a conversation Maisie had apparently had with her class about whether robots could feel lonely, which Maisie had reported in full and which Elliot had relayed to Lenora because he thought she'd find it interesting. She had. What was her conclusion? Lenora asked. She said she thought they could feel something, but she didn't think it was the same as lonely. She said lonely has a smell to it and robots don't have noses. A pause on the line. Then that's the most philosophically defensible position I've heard all week, and I've been in 3 executive strategy meetings. He laughed. She laughed. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and when she hung up, he stayed sitting for a moment in his office chair with the quiet feeling of a man whose life has a different weight to it than it did a year ago, more occupied. Somehow. More complete in the specific structural sense of a load-bearing wall that wasn't there before. There were rough patches. He'd have been more alarmed if there hadn't been. There was a Wednesday evening in January when Lenora canceled plans at 40 minutes' notice because a crisis at the company required her immediate attention, and Elliot, who had arranged coverage for his Thursday morning clinic to give himself a real evening off for the first time in 3 weeks, stood in his kitchen feeling a frustration he had no completely fair target for and took it out on a pan of pasta he overcooked by several minutes. He didn't call to say he was frustrated. He sent a text that said, "Hope the crisis is manageable," and went to bed. The next morning, she called at 7, before he'd left for the hospital. "I owe you an evening," she said. "You don't owe me anything. It was a work emergency." "I know what it was. I still owe you an evening." A pause. "Are you annoyed?" He considered lying and decided not to. "A little, not at you. At the situation. Those are sometimes the same thing," she said. "I know. I'm aware that my schedule is. I'm aware it's not easy," she said. There was something effortful in the admission. Not shame, but the particular honesty of someone who is very accustomed to the demands of their own life and is trying to see those demands from outside themselves. I've been here before. I know what it costs. I'm not Marissa's father, Elliot said. I'm not going anywhere because you had a work emergency. I know you're not. But I'll tell you when I'm a little annoyed. I'd rather you did, she said. The alternative is worse. He exhaled. The pasta was terrible. What were you making? Pasta with the good olive oil. I overcooked it by about 4 minutes. That's a tragedy, she said. I'll make it up to you with a dinner that doesn't involve either of us cooking. Saturday came. It was fine. More than fine, it was good and real and slightly imperfect. In the way of evenings between two people who are still learning each other's rhythms and haven't arrived at the smooth version yet, which was itself a sign that the thing between them was alive. The question of Maisie resolved itself in the way that questions involving Maisie tended to resolve themselves on Maisie's timeline, through Maisie's framework, with Maisie's specific logic applied in a way that made Elliot feel he should have known. This was how it was going to go. It was a Saturday morning in February, the kind of morning that still couldn't decide whether winter was ending, gray and flat, and just cold enough to make the house feel warm and sealed. Maisie was at the kitchen table working on a drawing she'd been absorbed in for an hour. Lenora had spent Friday evening at Elliot's and was still there in the morning, which was a first, and which Elliot had thought about carefully beforehand and decided was the right time because Maisie was old enough and resilient enough and had, as he had told Lenora months ago, been further along in processing this than either of them. What he had not anticipated was Maisie's response to finding Lenora at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug, which was to look up from her drawing with complete calm and say, "Hi, Grandma Lenora." Lenora looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at his daughter. "You're drawing," he said. "I know," Maisie said. "You're not." He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. "Are you okay?" Maisie set down her pencil with the patience of someone who has said something obvious and is waiting for the room to catch up. "Dad, I've known about this since October." Silence. "How?" Elliot said. "Because you got weird after the wedding, and then you got less weird gradually. And then in October you got normal again, but a different kind of normal." She picked up her pencil. "Also, you smile at your phone sometimes. It's easy to tell." Elliot sat down at the kitchen table. Lenora, across the kitchen, pressed her lips together in the specific way she did when she was suppressing something genuine. "Are you okay with it?" Elliot said. Maisie looked at him with those stubborn brown eyes that were his eyes in her face. "She's family," she said. "She's always been family. Now it's just different family." A shrug. "It's weird, but it's not bad weird. You can always tell me if it feels bad weird. I know." She looked at Lenora. "Do you want to see my drawing?" "It's a coral reef. It's technically one organism, but also many. Dad says many." "He's wrong." Lenora crossed the kitchen and sat down across from Maisie and looked at the drawing with genuine attention. "May I?" Maisie slid it across the table. "Your proportions are quite good," Lenora said. "Do you know what species this is?" She pointed. "Brain coral," Maisie said. "I looked it up. I have a photograph of one in my office. A real one, a photograph, not the coral itself, obviously. Someone took it in the Caribbean in the 70s. She looked at Maisie. "You'd be interested in it, I think." Maisie studied her. "Can I see it sometime?" "Yes, okay." Maisie retrieved her drawing. "Dad, can you make eggs? The good kind." Elliot stood up from the table. "The good kind requires you to set the table. That's not a rule." "It is now." Maisie grumbled in the theatrical way she reserved for household requirements. But she got up and got the plates, and Elliot made eggs at the stove, and Lenora sat at the table and drank her coffee and watched, and the morning moved around them with the unhurried quality of a Saturday that doesn't have anywhere particular to be. It was not perfect. It would not always be easy. But it was real and warm, and it felt like the beginning of something that had the structure to hold. What surprised Elliot most, over the months that followed, was not the complexity. He had braced for complexity. He had run through the scenarios in his head, the social geometry of it, the way other people would look at them at events, the particular raised eyebrow of hospital colleagues who heard something through the professional grapevine and weren't sure how to respond. Some of that happened. He attended a hospital gala with Lenora in March, and a senior colleague caught his eye across the room, with a look that Elliot acknowledged and did not explain, because the look didn't require an explanation, and an explanation would have been for the colleague's comfort, not his own. Lenora arrived in a dress that was not trying to be anything other than what it was, and she shook hands with people and asked them intelligent questions about their work. And by the end of the evening, 3 of Elliot's colleagues had separately told him she was impressive, which he received with a straight face. She was, obviously. That wasn't news. What surprised him was the texture of what they'd actually built, how domestic and unmagnificent most of it was. Not in a disappointing way. In the way of real things, which are mostly made up of small moments that only acquire significance in retrospect. Sunday mornings in his kitchen. Her sitting at his table with files spread in front of her, while he was on a video call with a patient's family in the other room, because Sunday was the only day both of them were available, and the world did not stop requiring their attention just because it was Sunday. The time she showed up at his hospital for lunch, because she had a meeting in the same part of the city, and they ate in the cafeteria with its terrible coffee and its institutional lighting, and she did not comment on the terrible coffee or the lighting, which he noticed. The time he sat in the back of a car with her during a 40-minute drive to a foundation event she needed to attend, and they argued with genuine heat about a city infrastructure bill. She thought it was inadequate. He thought it was a reasonable compromise given the political constraints. She thought reasonable compromise was what you called settling when you'd run out of energy. He thought she was wrong and said so directly, and she disagreed with equal directness. And when they arrived at the venue, neither of them had conceded anything, but neither of them was angry. Just 2 people who had not agreed and were fine with that, which was its own kind of milestone. The fact of her enormous wealth never entirely disappeared. It was real and present, and occasionally jarring in the specific way of things that exist on a completely different scale from your ordinary reference points. Her apartment was not his apartment. Her car was not his car. When she took Maisie to see the coral reef photograph in her office, she also apparently showed Maisie the architectural model of the school restoration, and Maisie came home with the focused excitement of a child who has been shown something that has connected to something she didn't know she cared about, and she talked about it for 3 days. The scope of what Lenora did and what she owned was simply part of who she was, and Elliot had stopped finding it destabilizing the same way you stop finding any constant background condition. Destabilizing, it simply became part of the landscape. What mattered was Sunday morning eggs with Maisie arguing about coral reefs. What mattered was Lenora at his kitchen table, slightly irritated about a contractor, asking him to confirm that the original ironwork in the school skylight could bear the load of new glass, and trusting his answer even though structural engineering was not his specialty, because she trusted his judgment in general. What mattered was the way she looked at Maisie sometimes, with the particular quality of someone who is being surprised by how much they care about something they hadn't anticipated caring about. And Maisie, for her part, approached Lenora with the pragmatic affection of a child who has decided someone is worth knowing and is now proceeding accordingly. She showed her drawings. She challenged her at board games with ruthless focus. Lenora had been caught off guard by this early, and had thereafter played with full seriousness, which Maisie respected. She asked her detailed questions about buildings and designs, and why certain old things were worth saving and others weren't. And Lenora answered these questions as though they were adult questions, because in Maisie's case, they essentially were. She lost at Monopoly. Maisie told Elliot one evening, with the tone of a naturalist reporting a significant field observation. She was annoyed. She didn't say so, but her face did that thing. What thing? The still thing. Maisie demonstrated briefly a composed, neutral expression that was actually recognizable. But then she bought me a hot chocolate on the way home, so I think she's okay. That's a reasonable conclusion. I like her, Maisie said. Simply, in the way she said things she'd decided about. She's complicated, but she tries to be fair. That's the most important thing. Elliot looked at his daughter. That's a very accurate observation. I know. She went back to her book. He sat there for a moment in the quiet of the evening and thought about all of it, the months of careful navigation, the bridge in December, the phone call from Lenora that had lasted 20 minutes and rearranged several things he'd thought were settled. He thought about Marissa, who had gone quiet for a day and then called her mother and asked the question that mattered most: does he make you feel like yourself? He thought about how long it had taken him to admit what was already true. How many reasonable arguments he'd assembled against the very thing he actually wanted. How the arguments had all been valid and none of them had been sufficient. He thought about 61-year-old men who know something is wrong and keep moving the deadline for dealing with it, because knowing requires doing, and doing is terrifying. He thought about the fact that he was 32 years old and had a daughter who organized toys by personality and a former wife who had been generous beyond what anyone could have reasonably expected, and a woman who asked him careful questions about structural engineering and lost at Monopoly and called from airports and had 3-second silences before she said anything that mattered. He thought about how none of this looked like what he would have drawn on a map and how it was the most coherent thing in his life. Maisie turned a page. The house was quiet and warm. Somewhere across the city, in an apartment that Elliot had been to enough times, now that he knew which drawer the good teaspoons were in, a woman with a composed face and a habit of thinking carefully before she moved was probably reading something dense and making notes in the margin. And she might call later or she might not, and either way was fine. He had stopped being at the edge of it. He was in it now. And the difference, the actual felt difference between those two positions, was something he suspected he was going to spend a long time being grateful he hadn't managed his way around. 14 months is not a long time, measured against the scale of a building that has been standing for a century. But measured against the scale of a human life, against the specific, compressed timeline of two people who found each other sideways through the wreckage of one relationship and the careful architecture of something new, 14 months is considerable. It is long enough for a 7-year-old to turn 8 and develop strong opinions about watercolor technique. Long enough for a cardiac surgeon to have learned which drawer the good teaspoons were in and stopped thinking of it as remarkable information. Long enough for a restoration project that began as a set of annotated floor plans in a woman's meticulous handwriting to become something you could stand inside and look up at and feel. The Bellamy Arts Center opened on a Thursday evening in late October, 14 months after the bridge. It had not been a smooth 14 months for the building. Nothing about restoring a century-old structure ever is, regardless of how thorough the planning or how experienced the contractors. There had been the skylight dispute, which Lenora had eventually resolved with a fourth structural engineer who certified the original ironwork and whose report she had delivered to the preservation board with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting for the correct answer and had simply kept asking until it arrived. There had been a plumbing discovery in the east wing pipes, so compromised they had to be entirely replaced, which added 4 months to the timeline and to a significant sum to the budget that Lenora absorbed through her foundation, without what Elliot could see was anything more than a brief expression of controlled irritation. There had been a contractor dispute and a materials delay and a period in the spring when the main hall ceiling had developed a water intrusion problem that required 3 weeks of remediation before the plaster work could proceed. And yet, the building that stood on that October evening was not the building Elliot had walked through 14 months ago. The cold, boarded, abandoned thing with its cracked skylight and its amber-green tile disappearing under decades of grime. What stood now was the original building, restored to the form of its own best intention. The limestone facade had been cleaned and repointed. The tall windows had their glass back, and the window frames had been rebuilt to their original specifications in reclaimed timber that matched the period. The main hallway tile had been cleaned and relaid where it was damaged, the restoration so carefully matched that you had to look very closely to find the seams between original and new. The classrooms were studios now 3 visual art spaces, a music room with acoustic paneling that Lenora had sourced from a company that worked exclusively on performance spaces, a design studio with north-facing windows and long work tables, and the kind of industrial shelving that serious artists understood immediately. And the skylight. The skylight was what it had always been, except now it was whole. All original ironwork, the missing pane replaced in period glass, the cracked panes restored. The slight convex curve in each panel remained. The detail that the preservation board had wanted to eliminate and that Lenora had refused to sacrifice, and what it did to the light that came through it on a clear afternoon was exactly what it had been designed to do 100 years ago by whoever had stood in that space and understood that light was structural and not decoration. On an October evening with the interior lights at full, the skylight was a different kind of beautiful. Not the scattered afternoon light, but something more deliberate. The iron geometry of it catching the interior glow and throwing faint shadow grids across the restored floor of the entrance hall. The amber and green tile, fully cleaned now and sealed, caught the light the way old things do when they've been returned to themselves. Not newness, but something better than newness. Rightness. The opening was not a gala. Lenora had been specific about this. It was a community event-free admission, open doors, the neighborhood invited before anyone else. The programming had been running in soft launch for 3 weeks already, the studios occupied, The first classes held. The first set of kids from the surrounding blocks standing at work tables with paintbrushes, and the particular focused uncertainty of people doing something new. The Thursday evening opening was simply the formal acknowledgement of something that had already begun. Elliot arrived with Maisie at 6:30, early enough that the crowd hadn't fully formed yet, and the buildings still had the quality of itself, the restored space breathing quietly before it filled with people. Maisie had worn her good coat without being asked, which was either a sign of maturity or a sign that she understood the occasion in some way Elliot hadn't had to explain. She walked into the main hall and stopped. She looked up at the skylight. "That's it," she said. "That's the one from the model. That's it." She stood there for a moment, looking up at the iron geometry and the glass panels and the way the light came through them. Then she said, with the tone of someone confirming a calculation, "It worked." Yes, she said it would. She was right. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and went to find the studio spaces, because she had been told there would be a visual art room, and she had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. The evening filled gradually. Lenora had arranged the programming with the same precision she brought to everything brief remarks. A tour, the studios open and staffed by the instructors who would be running classes. The neighborhood came. Not the city's philanthropy circuit, not the board members and foundation trustees who would have populated a different kind of opening. Those people were there, but they were not the point. The point was the woman who arrived with 2 teenagers and asked one of the studio instructors about the ceramics class schedule. The point was the elderly man who stood in the main hallway for a long time, looking at the tile floor with an expression Elliot couldn't fully read, something between recognition and loss, and who, when Elliot stood near him and said simply, "Did you know the building before?" turned and said he'd gone to school here in 9963, second grade. Elliot stood with the man for a while and listened to him describe the building as it had been, the smell of the hallways, the particular sound of the staircase, a teacher whose name he still remembered. The man ran his hand along the restored banister of the original staircase and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't think I'd see this again." Elliot thought about all of it later, about what it meant to restore something that had existed in other people's memories as the specific geography of their childhood. To give people back a place that had been part of their formation. There was something in that which exceeded the architectural or the philanthropic. It was closer to what he did in surgery in some oblique way, the retrieval of function from damage, the refusal to accept that something was beyond repair, simply because it looked that way from the outside. He was still thinking about this when he found Lenora across the hall, finishing a conversation with a woman from the neighborhood arts committee. He waited until they were done, and then stood beside her and looked at the hall, at the people moving through it, the tile floor, the light from the skylight falling on everything. "There's a man by the staircase who went to school here in 9963, Elliot said. Lenora followed his gaze. "I know, someone told me earlier. I've been meaning to find him." He touched the banister, Elliot said, like he was checking whether it was real. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing about restoration," she said. "New construction gives people something they've never had. Restoration gives them something back." A pause. "Those are completely different experiences." "Yes," Elliot said. She turned to look at him. She was wearing a deep of the wedding that was almost navy. Not the burgundy of the wedding, but there was something in the quality of the evening that pulled that night into the room with them anyway. The summer terrace, the string lights in the oak trees, 2 people ending up alone at a railing with the music coming through. "You're thinking about the wedding," she said. "Is it that obvious? You do a thing with your expression." She didn't elaborate further. He laughed shortly. "You've cataloged all of my tells. Most of them." Something moved across her face, the microversion, the shift underneath the composure. "I've had time to study." The hall was full around them, warm and full of voices, the sound of people in a space that had waited a long time to be useful again. Maisie had reappeared from the direction of the studios with a smear of something on her right hand that suggested she had found the painting supplies and made introductions. Caleb and Marissa were somewhere toward the far end of the hall. Marissa had made that choice, had stood in this room tonight in the particular grace of someone who has worked out how to hold complicated feelings without being held by them. Elliot was aware of all of it, the fullness of the room, the weight of the evening, the fact that 14 months of things had arrived at this particular Thursday in October. "Come with me," he said. Lenora looked at him. "Where?" "Just come with me for a minute." They slipped away from the crowd without ceremony. He knew the building well enough, by now, that he knew the side door that opened from the main hall into the smaller entrance corridor, and from there, the original corridor that led to the foot of the staircase, which was quieter than the main hall and lit differently, the overhead fixtures casting a warmer light than the hall's restored originals. He led her to the center of the entrance hall, directly beneath the skylight. At this hour, with the exterior dark and the interior lights up, the skylight was a pattern above them. The iron geometry, the glass panels, the slight convex curve that Lenora had gone to 4 engineers to protect. The shadow grids on the floor were faint but visible, the amber and green tile picking them up in the way the original designer had intended, the light falling through the structure the way it had fallen. For whatever children had stood here 100 years ago, carrying their books and their lunches, unaware that they were standing inside something that had been built to outlast them. The crowd noise from the main hall was a murmur from here, reduced to a background, present but distant. Lenora looked up at the skylight, then at him. "What are we doing?" "I have something to say," Elliot said. She waited, composed, as always. But he could see the thing underneath the warmth that had been there since the terrace, since the coffee shop, since the cold hallway of this very building 14 months ago when they had stood close enough to kiss. And she had stepped back and said not yet with a steadiness he had respected and needed, and sometimes still thought about as one of the clearest examples of integrity he had encountered in his adult life. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The ring box was small dark blue, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of thing that fits in a coat pocket without announcement. He had been carrying it for 11 days. Not because he'd been waiting for the right moment in the romantic movie sense of waiting for a right moment. He didn't think that way, and neither did she. But because he'd wanted to be in this building, on this evening, in this specific place, beneath the skylight they had both stood under, when neither of them had said what they were actually saying, and the evening had to arrive first. Lenora looked at the box. She looked at him. She said nothing. "The night we met," he said, "you told me something I've thought about more than almost anything else in the past 14 months. He held her gaze. You said you didn't mean the dress, I remember," she said. "I should have understood it then, what I actually meant. But I didn't have the language for it yet, and I think—" He paused, getting it right, because this mattered and Lenora deserved accuracy. "I think some truths need time before you can say them out loud without reducing them to something smaller than they are." She was very still. "I didn't mean the dress," he said. "I meant you. Not the version I observed from a distance, not the composed person at the railing, not the billionaire, not my former mother-in-law. I meant the person who reads cardiac journals because she decided to understand what scared her. The person who taught commission for infrastructural engineers the right answer mattered more than the convenient one. The person who asked Marissa a question about being careful and told me not yet in an empty hallway and meant both things completely." He looked at her. "I meant the person who lost at Monopoly and bought Maisie a hot chocolate on the way home. The person who calls from airports about nothing and means something by it. The person who showed me a cracked skylight and made me understand that things abandoned are not the same as things lost." He opened the box. The ring was simple, not because he hadn't considered alternatives, but because he knew her. He knew that Lenora Bellamy had never in her life needed something to announce itself. The ring was a thin gold band, with a single pale stone, clean-cut, chosen because it was itself, and not because it was trying to be anything more than what it was. "You told me once that restoration gives people something back," he said. "That it's a different experience from building something new." He looked at her. "I don't know which of those this is. I think it might be both. Something built from the beginning on a terrace in summer, and also something returned. To both of us." He closed his hand around the box, not offering it yet, just holding it between them. "Will you marry me, Lenora?" The hall was quiet around them. The skylight was above them. The tile was warm under their feet, amber and green, 100 years of standing still. 1 second, 2, 3. She didn't need the 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. And then, because she was Lenora, and she did not perform even in the moments that invited it, she reached out and took the ring box from his hand herself, looked at the ring for a moment with the careful attention she gave everything, and held out her left hand for him to put it on. Which he did. Slightly imperfectly, because his hands were not entirely steady, and she noticed this and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of grace. He kissed her under the skylight in the building she had refused to abandon, and the crowd noise from the main hall was a warm murmur around them. And somewhere in that crowd, Maisie was probably explaining coral reef classification to an arts instructor, who had not expected the evening to include a marine biology seminar, and Marissa was standing in the restored space of her own complexity, and managing it with the generosity she had always brought to the things that cost her. And the old man who had gone to school here in 1963 was touching a banister that had been waiting 60 years to be touched again. They told Maisie that night, on the drive home. Lenora was in the back seat with Maisie because Maisie had requested this arrangement. She had a habit of conducting important conversations in moving vehicles, which Elliot attributed to the combination of proximity and the fact that nobody had to look directly at anyone. Lenora told her, directly and simply the way she told Maisie everything. She showed her the ring. Maisie looked at it for a moment. "So you'll be at the house more," she said. "Yes," Lenora said. "Like all the time?" That would be the general idea. Maisie considered this with the focused expression of someone running a series of assessments. "Okay," she said, "but I'm not calling you Grandma anymore if you live there. That's going to be weird. What would you like to call me?" Lenora said, with the steady patience she had developed for these negotiations. Maisie thought about it. "Nora," she said. "Is that okay?" A pause. "That's fine," Lenora said. "Good." Maisie looked out the window. Then after a moment, "I knew since February, by the way, that he was going to ask you." Elliot glanced in the rearview mirror. "How?" "He started running more," Maisie said. "He always runs more when he's working something out." And then he stopped being nervous about the answer, which meant he'd already decided what he was going to do. She looked at him in the mirror with her stubborn brown eyes. "Also, I found the box in your coat pocket when I was looking for change for the vending machine." Silence. "That was 3 weeks ago," Elliot said. 11 days, Maisie corrected. He drove. Lenora, in the back seat, pressed her lips together in the way she did when something was genuinely funny, and she was giving it the respect of not laughing immediately. 11 days, Elliot said. "I didn't tell anyone," Maisie said, with the dignity of someone who has kept a secret for 11 days and would like this acknowledged. "Not even Mom." "Thank you," Elliot said. "You're welcome." "A beat. Can we get hot chocolate?" They called Marissa that night, after Maisie was in bed. Elliot made the call. That felt right. It was his call to make, and Lenora had made hers 4 days before the bridge, and the division of responsibility between them had always been clear on this particular territory. Marissa picked up on the third ring. "Elliot." He paused. "I've something to tell you." A silence, brief. But he knew her well enough to read it. She already had some sense of what was coming. She was Lenora's daughter, and she had been generous enough to give them this, and she was human enough to have prepared herself for the eventual shape of what she'd given. "I asked your mother to marry me tonight," he said. She said yes. The silence that followed was longer. He sat with it without rushing it, because Marissa deserved the full space of her own response. "Okay," she said. Give me a second." He waited. He heard her exhale slowly, the particular exhale of someone absorbing something they've been ready for and still needed a moment with. "Is she there?" Marissa said. "Yes. Can I talk to her?" He handed the phone to Lenora, who was sitting beside him on the couch, and went to the kitchen to give them privacy. He made tea, the good kind, the kind Lenora liked, because it was something to do with his hands. He heard the low murmur of Lenora's voice from the other room, but not the words. He was in the kitchen for about 8 minutes. When Lenora appeared in the doorway, she was holding the phone at her side, and her expression was composed in the way that meant she had been through something and had arrived at the other side of it. "She's okay," he said. "She's okay." Lenora set the phone on the counter. She paused. She said she trusts us to be good to each other. Those were her exact words, a beat. And she asked if Maisie knew. Maisie knew 11 days ago. She found the ring box. Something crossed Lenora's face. Then she sat down at his kitchen table and laughed. A real laugh, longer than her usual, the surprised kind that had been there since the terrace, except it came more easily now, had been coming more easily for months, the composure cracking open at the seams into something warmer and less managed. He sat down across from her. They sat at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. The kitchen, with Maisie's drawings on the refrigerator and the coffee maker that had survived one marriage and was apparently going to witness the beginning of another. And they drank tea and talked about nothing important for an hour, and it was the best hour of the entire extraordinary evening. They married 8 months later, on a Saturday in June, beneath the restored skylight of the Bellamy Arts Center. It had not been a complicated wedding to plan, because neither of them was a person who needed complication in their celebrations. Lenora had organized the space with the precision she brought to everything. The flowers were from a local grower whose work she'd admired. The food was catered by a restaurant in the neighborhood. The guest list was short enough that every person on it was someone who genuinely mattered, rather than someone who needed to be managed. Marissa was there. She had needed 8 months to arrive at a version of this she could fully inhabit, and she had done that work honestly and without asking anyone to accommodate the difficulty of it, which was exactly the kind of person she was. She stood in the building that had once been her mother's project and was now something the neighborhood had claimed as its own. And she wore a blue dress, and when Elliot caught her eye before the ceremony, she gave him the smile that wasn't her regular smile, the complicated one, the honest one. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. That was enough. It was more than enough. Caleb stood beside Elliot, because where else would he stand? He had been there since they were 23, and fumbling through residency had been the unlikely bridge between the life Elliot had built and the life he was building now. And the fact that his presence at this wedding was both simpler and stranger than his presence at the last one was something all three of them understood without having to say. Maisie wore a dress she had selected herself, dark green, which she had defended on the grounds that green was a serious color, and she was a serious person attending a serious occasion. She stood beside Elliot during the ceremony with the focused composure of someone executing a role she had taken seriously, and when the officiant reached the part that required a ring, she produced it from the small bag she carried with the efficiency of someone who had been trusted with an important task and had absolutely no intention of mishandling it. The ceremony was short. Elliot and Lenora had written their own words, because they were people who thought carefully about what they said and didn't want to stand beneath a skylight they both remembered and recite something that wasn't theirs. What they said to each other was specific and plain and true, not the elevated language of vows designed to sound significant, but the language of two people who had been through enough to know the difference between what sounds important and what is. He told her he had been afraid of what they were for a long time, and that the fear had been its own kind of information, that things not worth having don't tend to frighten you. He told her she was the most honest person he had ever known, which was the most useful thing a person could be. He told her he intended to be worth her 3-second silences for as long as she was willing to have him. She told him she had watched him for an hour before he walked onto a terrace and said a sentence that told her who he was. She told him she did not make significant commitments lightly, which he knew, and that this was the least light thing she had ever done, which she wanted him to understand. She told him she had spent her adult life building things intended to outlast her, and that this what they had made between them in 14 months and 8 more was the one she cared most about. Then the officiant said what officiant said. Then they were married. Maisie, standing beside her father, allowed exactly 3 seconds of public sentiment before she said, in a voice pitched for adults, that she was hungry and would like to know when the food was starting, which broke the silence in the way only Maisie could completely and with perfect timing, and the room laughed with the full-throated relief of people who needed to laugh after something that had mattered. And Lenora looked at this 8-year-old child who was not hers by birth and was unmistakably hers by everything else. And what crossed her face in that moment was not the composed expression, or the microshift, or any of the managed versions. It was just her face, unguarded, in the light from the skylight. Years have a way of organizing themselves into the thing you remember, and the long, undramatic stretches between the things you remember. What Elliot remembered in the years that followed was not the hard parts, though there were hard parts, because there are always hard parts, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. He remembered the ordinary accumulation. Sunday mornings that became Sunday mornings with a different shape. Maisie at 9, at 10, at 11 growing into her own opinions about art and architecture and marine biology, and the moral responsibility of people who had resources, which she had been absorbing from Lenora, with the focused efficiency of a person who has found a subject worth taking seriously. Hospital dinners where Lenora sat at a table full of cardiologists and asked questions that made them rethink the framing of their own research. The Art Center on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 years after it opened, walking through and seeing the studios full, seeing work on the walls, seeing the particular quality of concentration on the faces of people doing something they hadn't known they needed until the space existed to do it in. He remembered a fight in their 3rd year, a real one, about something specific that had grown into something larger, the way fights do when two people who are both accustomed to being right find the edge of their accommodation. It lasted 3 days and was resolved not through one big conversation, but through a series of smaller, less comfortable ones that required both of them to say things they had been organized around avoiding. Afterward, the air was clearer, and there was something between them that hadn't been there before. Not a repair, exactly, but a kind of evidence. Proof that what they'd built could sustain weight that wasn't purely the pleasant kind. He remembered asking Maisie once, when she was 12, what she thought about all of it. Not fishing for reassurance, genuinely asking, because she was old enough to have a real answer. She thought about it for a minute with the seriousness she brought to real questions. "I think you both had to get through a lot of reasons not to," she said. "And you did it anyway. That's the part that matters." She paused. "Also, Nora taught me how to read architectural plans, which I'm going to use. So that was worth something independent of everything else." He had thought about that answer for a long time. You both had to get through a lot of reasons not to. That was it, wasn't it? That was the thing at the center of all of it. Not the age gap or the $1 billion or the former marriage or the raised eyebrows at a hospital gala or the 4 months of careful navigation before a first kiss on a stone bridge in December. Those things had all been real. They had all mattered and cost something and required management and grace from people who didn't owe it. But the through line of the whole story, if you stood back from it far enough to see its shape, was two people who had accumulated a significant list of reasons not to, and had reached a point where the reasons, valid as they were simply not enough. That was not a romantic idea. It was a practical one, a surgical one almost. You assess the risk, you assess what you stand to lose if you don't act, and then you make a call and you hold to it. Elliot had spent his career making those calls. He knew what it felt like to be standing in an operating room with someone's heart in an imperfect state and to have to decide. Not whether the situation was ideal, because it never was, but whether the thing in front of you was worth trying to save. The answer in his experience was almost always yes. Almost always, the thing that looked most damaged was the thing most worth returning to itself. People asked them, over the years, how they fell in love. It was a reasonable question. Their story had a geometry that invited it, the unusual angles of it making people curious about the sequence. Lenora always smiled before she answered. Not the composed smile, the real one, the short, surprised version that had been there since a terrace in summer, except it came easily now, came often, had become simply part of her face in the way that things you stop fighting eventually do. "He told me my dress was beautiful," she said. Elliot, beside her, always corrected her. She knew immediately that I wasn't talking about the dress. And then, because they had told this enough times, that the rhythm of it had become its own kind of language. Lenora would look at him in the way she had looked at him on a stone bridge in December, and in a restored hallway beneath a skylight, and at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. The look that was not managed. The look that was simply her. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. And that is where their story ends. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a grand resolution, but in the accumulated weight of two people who chose each other in the full knowledge of what that choice would cost and what it would require and what it could not guarantee. Who chose anyway? Who found that choosing anyway past all the reasons and the complications and the careful management was not the reckless thing it had appeared to be from the outside. It was the most deliberate thing either of them had ever done. And it lasted.